In the 1930s, the Soviet Union did everything possible to demonstrate to the world how progressive communist ideas were. Outside the USSR, articles in the press appeared glorifying Stalin and his course for collectivization, which in reality was forceful integration of individual households into collective farms. The articles were written by people like, for example, the celebrated American journalist Walter Durante. However, Ukrainian villagers did not fit into the ideal picture. They did not want to join collective farms and voluntarily give away what they had earned. Resistance was also growing in Ukrainian cities, among the intelligentsia in particular. So the Soviet regime decided to break their resistance physically. In 1932 to 1933, millions of Ukrainians died. Rumors of this spread throughout the Soviet Union and abroad. Even fabricated statistics could not stop them. Therefore, the Soviet government enabled its propaganda machine and hid the Holodomor for many decades behind silence and fake facts that should have been dispelled forever. However, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia, as its successor, continues to aggressively oppose the recognition of the Holodomor, using increasingly aggressive methods of propaganda, including outright lies. Lie number 1. There was no Holodomor. Dozens of villages died in the famine, and those who survived were forced to keep silent so as not to incite the members of the NKVD to pursue their families and friends. The Soviet government tried all means to limit the leakage of information and falsified statistics on the number of people killed by the artificial famine. Foreigners also contributed to this. For example, the journalist Durante described the famine only as temporary difficulties that simply had to be endured. He claimed that there were no deaths in the USSR. Most foreign diplomats who came to the Soviet Union did not have access to the real picture or preferred not to notice it. They were allowed to see only specially created Potemkin villages, in which, as in theatrical performances, extras were dressed as villagers and tables were set. The topic of the Holodomor was silenced in the Soviet Union until the late 1980s. However, archival records have been preserved. Among those documents, there were decrees and resolutions on food confiscations, restrictions on movement for Ukrainian villagers, and a ban on foreign journalists from leaving cities. Together with the memories of thousands of survivors, they serve as proof of the crime committed in 1932 to 1933 by the Soviet government with Joseph Stalin at its top.
Радянська міфологія приховувала саме поняття голоду. В Радянському Союзі голоду не могло бути. І центральним міфом є те, що голодомору, голод, можливо, був. Були продовольчі утруднення, можливо, навіть десь голод. Але голодомору, тобто штучного, свідомого знищення населення України, не було.
Lie number 2. Poor crops caused the famine. This lie has long been supported by Soviet historians, who had no idea of the real events of that period. In fact, the weather conditions in 1932 to 1933 were favorable, and the yield was sufficient. The grain harvest in 1932 was actually less because fewer seeds had been sown. So the reason was not the amount of precipitation or atmospheric pressure, but the ill-considered agricultural policy of the state. People were dying of famine in the villages of Podillia. And only 200 meters from there, over the Zbruch River in Poland, people had enough food. In addition, in 1932 to 1933, the USSR rejected any offers of help from other countries, and even more, it actively exported grain. Line number 3. The famine spread throughout the whole USSR. Many eyewitnesses recall that people in Ukrainian villages suffered because there was nothing to eat, while in neighboring Russia and Belarus, people had no food problems. Interestingly, only in the territory of Ukraine and Russian Kuban, inhabited mainly by Ukrainians, that there was a system of blackboards, or boards of infamy. It was forbidden to enter and leave villages, and accordingly, to supply any food. On January 22, 1933, the Soviet government issued a resolution banning people from leaving Ukraine and Kuban. In addition, villagers were deprived of the right to buy train tickets and barred from entering cities. It was the territory where the most Ukrainians lived and where the mortality rate from the famine was the highest. This fact proves that the Holodomor was indeed the policy of the Soviet government against Ukrainians. Line number 4. Ukrainians did not resist. In fact, the resistance to collectivization on the part of Ukrainian villages was one of the main reasons why they were exterminated by starving people. In 1930, 1/3 of all village demonstrations against the Soviet rule among the republics of the USSR happened in Ukraine. More than 1 million people took part in them. In the same year, activists, grain procurement commissioners, and workers of the state political administration were attacked 2,779 times in Ukrainian villages. It was 1/5 of all such cases across the USSR. For example, the territory of the Dnipropetrovsk region, in just 4 months, from October 1932 to January of 1933, recorded 7 murders of activists, 10 attempted murders, 5 injuries, 6 cases of beatings of government officials. Villagers would set fire to state institutions and collective farm buildings. They would come to a collective farm building, protest, and take their cattle and grain back. Or they would simply refuse to work for nothing and sabotage the process. In the conditions of constant searches, in order to survive, people tried to hide at least some food, using pits, basements, attics, or burying supplies. Similarly, in the fall, thousands of people tried to run away from villages. However, all these actions did not grow into a mass consolidated movement. The remnants of the village resistance were broken by total physical destruction.
Весною, коли почався голод, то мій дідусь Яків Федорович Обжирко разом із іншими ось такими, значить, з тими, котрі ніби є оця місцева еліта, значить, містечкова, так? Вони об'єдналися і створили такий на громадських засадах сиротинець. Тобто спробували дітей, просто збирали дітей із тих обійсть, де помирали батьки, збирали їх докупи і пробували їм організувати якийсь прохарчунок, от якусь громадську кухню, значить, якийсь там куліш, от щось таке. От. Тобто, щось їм там на якомусь етапі вдавалося, коротше кажучи, 2 місяці діда в родині не бачили. Взагалі, бо він приходив пізно вночі, а вранці, значить, о 4-й ранку туди біг. От. Історія полягає на тому, що до кінця 33-го року всі його товариші, це було десь близько 60 людей, які тим займалися. Тобто опором, резистансом, спробою протиставитися голоду. Це, до речі, теж один із таких, знаєте, цих, я би сказала, імперських мемів, от уявляти собі, що українці давалися вбивати цілковито, значить, покірно, значить, просто собі мерли, як ягнята собі десь там на печах, знаєте. Ні. І спроби самоорганізації були, і спроби, значить, вчинити опір, і спроби, значить, і, не тільки повстання, але і спроби організаційні, навіть інституційні. Значить, створити ніби сітку оцю волонтерську сітку, волонтерську мережу, щоб протиставитися голоду. Так ось до кінця 33-го року. І ось це те, що я можу засвідчити перед історією от з цього родинного переказу, з пам'яті, значить, моїх рідних і з цієї от найранішої дитячої маминої пам'яті. До кінця року всі вони, ті, хто займався організацією громадських сиротинців, були вивезені ночами чорним воронком один по одному.
Line number 5. The Holodomor was organized by locals. Such a myth was advantageous to the Kremlin to absolve itself of responsibility for the Holodomor of 1932 to 1933. It was beneficial for them to say that Ukrainians killed their own people. In fact, the ruling elite was multinational. They acted primarily as representatives of the communist totalitarian regime, not some ethnic group or nationality who carried out orders given from above, and were part of a single system. Even so, some officials tried to mitigate the situation in Ukraine, warning that it was critical and asked to cut the grain procurement plans. Instead, the central government in Moscow refused and tightened its grip, as evidenced by the archival documents from the Communist Party conferences and congresses. Line number 6. There was no mass mortality due to the famine. In 1926, almost 31.2 million Ukrainians lived in the USSR, and in 1937, there were only 26.4 million left. To compare, the number of Russians during this time increased from 77.8 million to almost 94 million people. Belarusians from 4.74 million to 4.87 million people. In addition, mass graves have been recorded, as evidenced by thousands of Holodomor eyewitnesses who managed to survive. These facts prove that entire families and streets died out, so there should be no doubt that the Holodomor was massive. Line number 7. We have known everything about the Holodomor for a long time. Some of the valuable oral testimonies of the Holodomor eyewitnesses have already been lost. Millions of people who survived those events died. And most of the documents have not yet been processed, although the archives of the KGB in Ukraine are available to all. However, the main and most important ones are still kept secret in Moscow. Until Russia, the successor of the Soviet Union, recognizes the Holodomor, this piece of information will remain closed to the world.
Це все відбувалося у закритій державі. До речі, те ж саме було і з Холокостом. Поки не закінчилася Друга світова війна, масштаби цього злодійства були невідомі. Вони стали відомі тільки у зв'язку з поразкою гітлерівської Німеччини у війні. А Радянський Союз не зазнав поразки, він виграв війну. Другу світову. І тоді він не зазнавав поразки. Він міг це робити абсолютно безкарно, просто пояснюючи, от голод на нашій території, намагаємося людям допомогти. Але не все в наших силах. Масштаби голоду приховувалися. Постанови партійних і радянських органів, які фактично цей голод зробили штучним, приховувалися. Досі в Москві продовжують стверджувати про те, що це був не штучний голод, спираючись на всі ці рішення, які ухвалювалися в сталінські періоди, які маскували справжні масштаби трагедії.
Line number 8. The Holodomor was not genocide. Genocide is an intentional act aimed at physically destroying an entire ethnic, national, racial, or religious group. The policy pursued by the Soviet Union in the territory of Ukraine was directed precisely against Ukrainians. No other national group has suffered such losses. Nowhere, except in the areas where Ukrainians lived compactly, were such methods used. The decisions of the top leadership of the USSR, medical registers, death registers, eyewitnesses' accounts, and hundreds of other documents are proving it. Thus, the Holodomor is genocide of the Ukrainian nation, and it has been recognized by 17 countries, including Ukraine.